II, First Steps Towards Global Influence, 1893 to 1913. Now, during the 19th century, we've seen the United States was expanding, but it was expanding within the continent of North America. And so during the 1800s, the 19th century that is, the United States was becoming a continental power, but not a global power. But after 1893, the United States began to expand beyond its borders. Now, we've seen that there were a number of factors involved with this: the closing of the frontier, the enormous growth in American productivity, and the search for both markets and raw materials. And all of this led to the annexation of Hawaii, which was the first major step in America's expansion overseas beyond its borders. And as we see in the second unit, it was American sugar planters allied with Congregationalist ministers or missionaries in Hawaii who fomented a revolution against the Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani, and really resulted in an overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy. And initially Congress rejected the annexation of Hawaii as a colony, but eventually under William McKinley, Congress did accept it. The next major area of American expansion, of course, was Cuba, and Spain was a declining colonial power, and the United States moved in. Spain governed Cuba in a very undemocratic, repressive way, and so there was a lot of sympathy in the American public for the Cuban revolutionaries. However, Americans had kind of an ambivalent, or if you will say, divided attitude towards the Cubans in terms of annexing Cuba as we had annexed Hawaii, because Cuba had a much larger population, but also a large population of African descent. And of course, the 1890s was really the height of racism in America. And many of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution were men of color. The three major leaders were Maximilio Gomez, Antonio Maceo, and Jose Marti. And Antonio Maceo was an Afro-Cuban. And so the idea of a country bringing in where the leadership were many of them men of color was not something that many Americans were comfortable with. But when the American battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor in 1893, Congress declared war on Cuba and sent troops down into Cuba and very quickly defeated the Spanish militarily. At the same time, the campaign against Spain's other colony in the Philippines was a naval campaign, which was accomplished very quickly because Spain had such a obsolete navy. And the third colony, Puerto Rico, was really not a contest because the Puerto Ricans themselves welcomed annexation to the United States, and Spain really did not do much to defend Puerto Rico militarily. The congressional resolution to make war against Spain was added to, tacked to it, the Teller Amendment, which was an amendment to the congressional resolution, specifically denying America's attempt to annex Cuba. However, once Cuba did receive its independence, it turned out it was independence on paper. And first of all, the United States occupied the island and did not even permit democratic elections in Cuba until about 2 years after the American occupation. And they weren't that democratic because they were supervised by American soldiers. So it was a very pro-American government that was put into power. Um, and soon the Cubans adopted American style constitution. The leader of the new president of Cuba as an independent country was a Cuban who had been living in exile in New York City and was very closely tied to the U.S. government. And so the first Cuban constitution contained what was called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was an amendment to the Cuban Constitution which specifically permitted American intervention in Cuban affairs. And so Cuba became a country with independence on paper, but really a virtual colony of the USA. The other country where American involvement was extensive was in Panama. And Panama was a province, actually, of the Latin American nation of Colombia. Panama was very ripe for American influence because it was the site of a proposed canal. There was not yet a Panamanian canal, but because it was such a narrow strip of land, it was ideal to construct a canal that, of course, greatly facilitated ships going from New York to San Francisco. Instead of having to go all the way around the tip end of South America, they could now pass through the canal and make the trip from east to west or from west to east much, much easier. So the United States was very interested in building a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. But the Colombian government refused to give the Americans the rights that they wanted. So Teddy Roosevelt basically encouraged the Panamanians to declare their independence from the country of Colombia and set themselves up as an independent nation under American auspices. And then the Panamanian leaders then agreed to the terms the Americans wanted to construct the Panama Canal. So the creation of Panama really was a creation of the USA. And of course, behind all of these expansions, there were other troops that were sent in the Caribbean. And of course, we will use, your reading looks at the American intervention in the Mexican Revolution. And we intervened extensively in the Mexican Revolution. And all this was under the doctrine of the Monroe Doctrine, which of course claimed that Latin America was the special area of influence for the United States. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Today, the Monroe Doctrine really doesn't mean very much, and as we will see, about 75 to 80 years later, Latin American countries began to challenge that and to assert their independence, but that was far into the future. So the Monroe Doctrine was really the basis for American influence in Latin America at this time. Now, the other major area of American expansion was China. China was going through a lot of internal turmoil, and the United States demanded access to Chinese markets and access to Chinese businesses through the so-called open door policy. And then in 1911, the Chinese overthrew the emperor and established a democratic republic under Sun Yat-sen. He was soon overthrown by a military dictator named Yuan Shikai, and China continued in internal turmoil between landed aristocrats and poor people, and then Japanese invaders. And Japan took advantage of the internal occupation, the internal strife in China. Japan began to make inroads in northern China, especially Manchuria and various other areas. So Japan was a rapidly expanding country. So this was a period of time. The late 19th century was a time of age of empires. And the United States basically adopted the philosophy of empire, symbolized by the English poet Rudyard Kipling, take up the white man's burden, which was the idea that the United States should basically promote white supremacy and the special interests of the Caucasian people over people of color. It was an area of globalization where European influence was predominant all over the world. And even in Japan, Japan was Europeanizing, becoming more adopting more European methods of technology and even government. And so this is a period of the total supremacy of Europe worldwide, politically in the form of colonialism, and even culturally and technologically in countries like Japan, which were rapidly adopting European technology. So it was a period in which European culture and values and European and Victorian mores were unquestioned. Now all that, as we will see, would become severely shaken and questioned by the trauma of World War II, of World War I. So the enormous destruction of World War I caused people to question European civilization and question European values and ultimately question European imperialism. So that's what we will see in the next unit, which is 1913 to 1921.